Imagine the unimaginable. A 5-month-old baby, paralyzed and unable to move. A heartbroken mother and father, praying for a miracle that seems too far away. Every day they watch their baby's tiny body remain still, with no sign of hope in sight. Then, on a quiet, seemingly ordinary night, something extraordinary happens. In the dim light of the nursery, their puppy Max, just a playful golden retriever, does something no one could have predicted. As their baby sleeps soundly in the crib, Max steps forward, nervous, determined, and filled with love. What happens next will leave you breathless. The impossible is about to unfold right before their eyes. Max's love and a miracle collide in the most incredible way, showing that sometimes the smallest, simplest gestures hold the greatest power. This is the story of how one puppy changed everything. Sarah and John had always dreamed of being parents, their hearts swelling with love the moment they saw their baby, Mia, for the first time. She was perfect, bright eyes, a joyful giggle, and an energy that lit up every room. But that joy was short-lived. At just 3 months old, something changed. Mia's tiny body, once full of movement and curiosity, became still. Her legs, which had kicked with excitement just weeks before, stopped moving entirely. The diagnosis came as a shock, a rare form of paralysis, with no clear cause and no cure. The doctors were unsure how much mobility Mia would regain, and the uncertainty was unbearable. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Sarah and John tried everything: doctors, therapies, special treatments, but nothing seemed to help. Their once vibrant home was now filled with quiet despair. In the midst of their heartbreak, they found comfort in the smallest of gestures: Max, their golden retriever puppy. Max had arrived in their lives at a time when they needed him the most. His playful antics, wagging tail, and ever-loving nature provided a distraction from their overwhelming sadness. But Max's role in their lives was about to change. As Mia lay in her crib one night, seemingly unaware of the world around her, Max's unwavering loyalty was about to reveal something extraordinary. What no one could have anticipated was that it would be Max's presence, more than anything, that would spark the miracle Sarah and John had been waiting for. The days had become harder to get through. Sarah and John's once bright optimism had been replaced by a haunting silence that hung over their home. The dreams they had once nurtured for Mia, watching her take her first steps, hearing her laugh as she played, now seemed like distant memories. Instead, they spent their days surrounded by medical documents, therapy schedules, and a never-ending cycle of doctor's visits. Mia's paralysis remained a constant presence in their lives, and with each passing day, the weight of uncertainty grew heavier. Despite their best efforts, nothing had worked. Mia's condition showed no signs of improvement. The doctors could offer no solutions, only vague assurances that they'd keep trying. Every day, Sarah and John questioned if their baby would ever walk again, if she would ever experience the world the way other children did. It felt as though they were running out of options, and hope was slipping through their fingers. At night, when the world outside seemed to go quiet, the loneliness and despair were at their peak. Sarah would sit in the nursery, her eyes never leaving Mia's crib. She could still remember the first time Mia had kicked her legs in excitement, how Sarah had laughed with joy. Now, her baby lay still, her legs unmoving, and Sarah's heart would ache with the quiet grief that she carried each day. She and John would whisper to each other at night, trying to find solace, trying to find a way to stay strong for their daughter. But the reality was that they were losing themselves in the struggle, unsure how much longer they could keep going like this. Max, their golden retriever puppy, was the only bright spot in their lives. At first, Sarah had been skeptical about getting a dog, worried about the added responsibility, but Max had proven to be a source of comfort they never expected. His energy, despite the sadness around him, was infectious. He had a way of lightening the mood, making them smile even on the darkest days. Every day, Max would sit by Mia's crib, his gentle presence providing the only comfort Sarah and John had. They hadn't expected the puppy to form such a deep bond with their baby, but there he was, always by her side, as though he understood. Despite Max's comforting presence, Sarah and John couldn't escape the feeling that they were helpless, that no amount of love or support could change Mia's condition. They were exhausted, emotionally drained, and overwhelmed by the weight of their circumstances. They had tried everything, and still, their daughter's paralysis remained unchanged. But what Sarah and John didn't know was that their lives were about to take a turn they couldn't have foreseen. Max was about to do something that would leave everyone in awe, a gesture of love and devotion that no one could have expected. The miracle they had been praying for was about to arrive, and it wasn't going to come from a doctor's office or a therapist's treatment. It was going to come from a small, loving puppy whose devotion to Mia would change everything. The days following Mia's diagnosis felt like an endless cycle of uncertainty. Sarah and John's lives were consumed with medical appointments, consultations with specialists, and endless research into any possible treatments that could help. But with each visit, the news was always the same. There was no clear path forward. The doctors had no answers. They had done all they could, and all that was left was waiting. The frustration was palpable. Sarah often found herself sitting in Mia's nursery late at night, watching her baby sleep, the quiet hum of the house only amplifying the silence in her heart. She longed for the days when Mia would be chasing after her favorite toys, or when her little hands would reach up to grab at her mother's fingers with uncontainable excitement. Those days felt like a distant memory now, replaced by the stillness that hung in the air. Mia's paralyzed body, once full of life, now seemed so fragile. Max, their golden retriever puppy, had been a welcome distraction, though. From the moment he arrived, his presence had been a balm for their aching hearts. At first, they had thought of Max as just a small companion, something to bring some light to their otherwise somber days. But as the weeks went by, they began to notice something peculiar about the way Max behaved. Every day, without fail, Max would quietly sit beside Mia's crib. Sometimes he would nudge her hand with his nose, as though trying to get her attention. At first, Sarah and John thought it was just a puppy's playful behavior, something to make them smile during a difficult time. But as the days turned into weeks, something about Max's behavior felt different. It wasn't just playfulness. It was as if Max knew that Mia needed him in a way no one else could understand. Max's bond with Mia grew stronger with each passing day. He would never leave her side, even when Sarah and John were busy with other tasks. At times, when Mia's room was quiet and still, Max would nudge her hand or softly curl up next to her crib. Sarah would watch from the doorway, her heart swelling with affection. There was a tenderness in Max's actions that spoke volumes. He was more than just a puppy. He was Mia's silent protector. One evening, Sarah noticed Max behaving differently. The room was dim, and Mia lay in her crib, her small body completely still. Max was pacing the room, as he often did, but tonight there was an urgency to his movements. His tail wasn't wagging, and his eyes darted between Mia and the door, as though he was trying to tell them something. Sarah couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. She watched as Max's movements grew more frantic. He seemed restless, like he was trying to communicate something that Sarah couldn't understand. "Max, what's wrong?" Sarah whispered, stepping into the room. But Max didn't stop. He stood by the crib, staring at Mia, and then suddenly he darted to the door, scratching at it with his paws as though trying to get out. Sarah's heart raced. "Max, what is it?" she repeated, her voice filled with concern. She approached him cautiously, unsure of what was happening. John, hearing the commotion, entered the room, his face filled with confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, noticing Max's strange behavior. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "He's acting like something's wrong. He's never been like this before." Max kept scratching at the door, his whimpers soft but filled with urgency. It was as though he couldn't sit still, as though something was drawing him to action. The puppy's behavior was unlike anything they had ever seen. John bent down and gently patted Max, trying to calm him, but Max didn't stop. He turned his attention back to Mia, his eyes full of focus, before pacing once more around the room. "What is it, boy?" John murmured, bewildered. Max had always been affectionate, but this was different. It was as though Max could sense something Sarah and John couldn't. "I don't know what's going on, but I feel like he's trying to tell us something," Sarah said softly, a feeling of dread creeping up her spine. She watched as Max stood near Mia's crib once again, his eyes locked on her. For a moment it was as if the world had gone silent. Then, with a sense of calm that seemed out of place, Max lay down beside the crib. His small body curled into a ball, but his gaze never left Mia. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. There was something about the way Max was lying there, so still, that sent a chill through her. It wasn't like Max at all. He was usually active, playful, but now he was utterly focused on Mia. Sarah stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. She placed her hand on the crib's edge and watched Mia. She looked peaceful, as though she was simply sleeping, but something about this moment felt different. There was a presence in the room, a strange connection that Sarah couldn't explain. It was as though Max's stillness had created a quiet energy in the room, a palpable force that Sarah could feel deep in her chest. Max nudged Mia's hand gently with his nose, and something incredible happened. Mia's hand, still and lifeless for so long, twitched. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Sarah saw it. Her breath caught in her throat and she glanced at John, her eyes wide with disbelief. "John, did you see that?" Sarah whispered. John, still standing in the doorway, stared at Mia, then at Max. "What just happened?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I think she moved," Sarah said, her voice shaking. Her heart raced as she reached into the crib and gently touched Mia's tiny hand. To her astonishment, Mia's fingers twitched again. Then, ever so slightly, her whole hand lifted. It was the first movement they had seen in months. Max's tail wagged faintly, as if to acknowledge the miracle. Sarah and John were frozen in place, their hearts pounding in their chests. What was happening? Could it be? Was this the miracle they had prayed for? Max had done something. They didn't know what, but somehow this puppy had sparked a response in Mia. It was small, but it was real. And as Max's gentle presence filled the room, they felt something they hadn't felt in months. Hope. The stillness in the room was almost unbearable. Sarah sat on the edge of Mia's crib, her hand lightly resting on her daughter's chest, her breath shallow as she tried to hold on to the hope that had suddenly stirred within her. John stood nearby, his face unreadable, as if he, too, was unsure of what he had just witnessed. The room felt charged, like the quiet before a storm. Max, their golden retriever puppy, had done something so small, yet so significant, that Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that a change had just begun. Mia's small hand had moved, a twitch, then a little more, as if it were reaching for something just out of grasp. But then, as quickly as it had happened, the room fell silent once more. Was it just a coincidence? Sarah wondered, her mind racing. The skeptic in her wanted to dismiss it as a momentary fluke, a muscle spasm, perhaps. But the way Max had acted, the way his presence seemed to stir something within Mia, gave Sarah pause. She stood up from the crib and turned to John, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you feel that?" John nodded, though his eyes were wide with disbelief. "I don't know what I felt, but something's different." His words hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. Max, ever loyal, had not moved from his spot by Mia's crib. His eyes were fixed on her, his body still, as though waiting for the next sign. The bond between them was undeniable, and for the first time in a long while Sarah began to wonder if the impossible was truly possible. Minutes passed, but no further movement came from Mia. The room, once filled with anticipation, now seemed empty. Sarah felt the weight of uncertainty settling in again. Maybe it wasn't a miracle. Maybe it was just a momentary glimmer of hope, a false sign that would disappear as quickly as it had appeared. Her heart felt heavy once more as the crushing weight of helplessness crept back in. But then something happened. Something that would shift everything once again. Max, who had been lying quietly by the crib, suddenly stood up and walked to the edge of the room. His ears were perked, his body tense. Without warning, he let out a soft whine, the sound vibrating in the stillness. He paced back and forth, his paws clicking on the hardwood floor. He seemed agitated, restless, and for a moment Sarah thought he might just need a walk. But then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Max turned around and trotted back to Mia's crib. He stopped, looked at Sarah with his soft, pleading eyes, and then returned to his place beside the crib. It was then that Sarah noticed something else. Mia's tiny hand, which had been still for so long, was now trembling ever so slightly. She wasn't sure if it was just her imagination or the lighting playing tricks on her, but it looked like Mia was beginning to respond. Her hand trembled more, then moved again, this time more deliberately, as though guided by Max's presence. The hairs on Sarah's arms stood on end, and her heart pounded in her chest. "John," Sarah whispered, unable to tear her eyes away from Mia's hand. "John, look, she's moving again. I think she's actually moving." Her voice cracked with disbelief, and John's eyes followed her gaze, his breath catching in his throat. Mia's hand continued to twitch. Then, slowly, her fingers curled. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes as she watched her daughter's fingers grip the air, just as they had when she was an infant, full of life and energy. The same hand that had been completely still for months was now responding, slowly but undeniably. It wasn't a spasm, it wasn't a reflex, it was movement. It was real. Max, standing by the crib, seemed to sense the change, too. His tail wagged gently, his eyes wide with anticipation. It was as though he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Mia to respond. And now, seeing her react, he stood still, watching her with a sense of calm, as if saying, "I knew you could do it." The miracle wasn't just happening in Mia's body. It was happening in the space between her and Max. Their silent connection was more than just physical. It was something deeper, something Sarah couldn't quite explain. She reached out, her hands trembling as she touched Mia's hand, feeling the warmth of life return to her child's fingers. Mia's hand continued to move, slowly but steadily. "I don't believe it," John whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. This is real." Sarah could only nod, her eyes locked on Mia, who was now moving her fingers and slowly, gently, reaching for her mother's touch. The miracle had begun, and they knew that what had started as a simple nudge from Max had unlocked something within Mia that no one had thought possible. As Sarah stood there, her hand resting on Mia's small, trembling fingers, she realized that this was just the beginning. The moment they had been praying for had arrived, and it had come in the most unexpected way, through the love and presence of a small puppy who had never once given up on their daughter. And in that moment, Sarah understood something far greater than she had ever imagined. Sometimes the greatest miracles come when you least expect them, and they arrive in the form of love, faith, and the unspoken bond between a puppy and a child. The air in the room seemed to hold its breath. Sarah's hands trembled as she watched Mia's tiny fingers twitch again. This time, it wasn't a gentle spasm. It was deliberate. It was real. Sarah's heart raced as she leaned forward, barely able to believe what she was seeing. It was as though the entire world had paused, leaving only this moment. Mia, her precious baby girl, was moving. Mia's body, once paralyzed, was beginning to respond, and standing right beside her crib, with his eyes fixed on Mia, was Max, her puppy, her guardian, the quiet force that had been by her side from the very beginning. Max's tail wagged softly as he sat beside Mia's crib, his eyes filled with something that Sarah couldn't quite name. Perhaps pride, perhaps understanding, or maybe it was something deeper. He had known all along. He had never stopped believing in the impossible. His loyalty, his love, had become the bridge between Mia's paralysis and the miracle that was beginning to unfold before their eyes. "Mia, baby," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Can you hear me, sweetheart? Can you feel me?" Mia's fingers twitched once more, this time curling slightly in response to her mother's touch. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to make Sarah's heart swell with a combination of disbelief and hope. She could hardly catch her breath. Could it really be happening? Was this a sign of something more? John stood at the foot of the crib, his face pale with astonishment. He had been silently watching from the corner of the room, unable to move, unable to speak as he witnessed what Sarah had seen. His eyes were fixed on Mia's small, fragile body, and for the first time in months he allowed himself to believe. Is this really happening?" His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. Sarah didn't answer him immediately. She couldn't. Her gaze was locked on Mia's hand, which was now showing a slow, rhythmic movement, an unmistakable sign that something profound was occurring. Mia's tiny fingers were no longer lifeless. They were grasping the air, trying to touch something, anything. Her hand moved again, this time lifting just a little as though reaching toward her mother's fingers. And then it happened. A small gasp escaped Sarah's lips as Mia's leg twitched. It was barely noticeable at first, a flutter of muscle beneath the surface, but it was there. Her leg moved. "Mia!" Sarah cried out, her voice filled with awe and disbelief. She reached down into the crib, carefully cradling Mia's tiny leg in her hands, as if she feared the moment would vanish if she didn't hold on to it. But it didn't fade. Mia's leg moved again, slowly, but undeniably. The miracle had begun. Max, who had been watching Mia with the most intense focus, let out a small bark, his tail wagging furiously now. He jumped up excitedly as if to say, "I knew you could do it." Sarah couldn't hold back the tears any longer. Her heart was overwhelmed with emotion, and the tears streamed down her face, mingling with the joy that had suddenly replaced the sorrow that had plagued her family for so long. "Mia," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you're moving. You're really moving." John stepped forward, his face full of disbelief, but his eyes were glistening with tears too. He knelt beside Sarah, his hand resting gently on Mia's head. He stroked her hair softly, as though reassuring himself that this wasn't a dream. "This is it," he said, his voice barely audible. "She's coming back to us." And it wasn't just the movement in Mia's legs or fingers that was miraculous. It was the sudden presence of something that had been absent for so long: hope. Sarah and John had spent months in despair, struggling to find meaning in the endless cycle of hospital visits and therapy sessions, clinging to a shred of hope that seemed to slip further and further away. But in this moment, when Mia's tiny hand moved and her leg twitched in response to her own will, everything changed. This was real. This wasn't just a sign of progress. It was a miracle. Max's role in all of this couldn't be understated. He had been there from the beginning, never wavering in his loyalty to the family, especially to Mia. From the first day he had curled up next to her crib, to the way he had nudged her hand and sat with her in silence, Max had become more than just a pet. He had become Mia's protector, her quiet strength. It was Max's love that had ignited the spark of hope within Mia, a spark that had grown into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. And as Max continued to stand beside the crib, wagging his tail and looking up at Sarah and John with what seemed to be a knowing expression, it was clear that the puppy had been an integral part of this miracle. His quiet, unspoken presence had been the catalyst for Mia's recovery. Max had never once given up on her, and now he was there to witness the impossible come true. Tears blurred Sarah's vision as she held Mia's small body close, gently rocking her in her arms. She whispered softly to her daughter, "You're so strong, baby. You've been so strong." John wrapped his arms around both of them, his hands trembling as he embraced his family. He looked down at Max, who was now resting contentedly at their feet, his eyes soft with the satisfaction of a job well done. In that moment, Sarah and John understood the true meaning of family. It wasn't just about blood. It was about the bonds we form with those who love us, the ones who stay by our side when things seem impossible. Max, in his own quiet way, had proven that love has the power to heal, to move mountains, and to turn the impossible into reality. The miracle didn't stop with Mia's movements. As the days passed, the small movements became larger. Mia's fingers gripped Sarah's hand more firmly. Her legs began to twitch and shift with increasing frequency. Every small movement was a triumph, a reminder that Mia was fighting her way back, and with the unwavering support of her family, especially Max, she was going to make it. The room was filled with love, relief, and the undeniable sense that their lives had been changed forever. What had seemed like an insurmountable obstacle was now a distant memory, and what lay ahead was a future full of possibility, hope, and the miracle that had been sparked by the simplest of things: a puppy's love. The days that followed Mia's miraculous movement were a blur of joy, disbelief, and overwhelming gratitude. Sarah and John had spent months drowning in fear, worry, and uncertainty, but now they found themselves immersed in a world of hope they hadn't dared to believe in for so long. It was as though the very air in their home had shifted, carrying with it a renewed sense of purpose and possibility. Mia's progress was slow, but it was undeniable. At first, it was only the smallest of movements, a twitch in her fingers, a slight nudge of her leg, a soft press of her tiny hand against Sarah's palm. But, day by day, those movements grew more pronounced. Mia's fingers curled around toys that had once lay forgotten in her crib. Her legs, once lifeless and unresponsive, now shifted in small, purposeful motions. For the first time in months, Mia's body was responding to the world around her. She was waking up from a paralysis that no one thought could be undone. Max, the golden retriever puppy, was right by her side every step of the way. His presence was unspoken, but his love was undeniable. He would sit beside Mia's crib, watching over her with a watchful eye, his tail wagging in rhythm with her progress. Sometimes, when Mia became frustrated with her movements or exhausted from her small victories, Max would nudge her gently, offering her silent encouragement. The connection between them was deeper than anyone had imagined, a bond that defied logic, transcending the barriers between animal and human, between hope and despair. Every night, Sarah would sit in the rocking chair beside Mia's crib, watching as Max curled up by her feet. The puppy had become part of their family, not just as a pet but as a true guardian, a silent protector who had witnessed their darkest moments and now stood beside them as a symbol of their hard-earned victory. As Mia's hand gripped her blanket tighter each night, Sarah and John couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. They had spent so many sleepless nights wondering if they would ever see these small victories, these signs of life, but now they were here. The miracle had not just been Mia's recovery, but the healing of a family. The dark cloud that had loomed over their lives for so long had finally begun to dissipate. The home that was once filled with silence and sorrow was now echoing with laughter, with hope, and with a deep sense of gratitude that Sarah and John could hardly put into words. Mia's recovery was far from over, and they knew there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, they had hope. The healing journey they were now on, fueled by the love of their daughter and the devotion of their puppy, was one they would face together. Every small step, every new milestone, every new movement would be a reminder of the love that had turned their world around. Max had shown them that even in the darkest of times, a miracle could happen when you least expect it. Mia's recovery continued to astound everyone who had been part of her journey. What had once seemed like a cruel fate was now slowly transforming into a story of hope, love, and perseverance. Each day, her body became more responsive, and though the road ahead remained uncertain, Sarah and John had learned to believe again. The miracle that had begun with Max's simple yet profound presence was now a constant reminder of the power of love and faith. Sarah and John knew that their lives would never be the same. They had witnessed the impossible. A child, once paralyzed, now showing signs of life again, and they owed it all to the quiet bond between Max and Mia. It wasn't just the doctors or therapies that had brought about the change. It was Max's unwavering loyalty and love. In a world that often seemed full of questions and no answers, Max had given them something more valuable than any medical treatment could: hope. Max's role in Mia's recovery wasn't just as a puppy. He was a symbol of what love can do, the unseen force that can bring about the unexplainable. His quiet presence, day after day, was a testament to the idea that sometimes the smallest gestures, the simple act of being there for someone, can change the course of everything. For Sarah and John, their journey had only just begun. The road to full recovery would still be long, but they faced it with a sense of purpose and determination they hadn't had before. Every small step, every new movement from Mia was a reminder that miracles happen in the most unexpected ways. They had learned that love, in all its forms, was the greatest force in the world. It had healed their daughter, saved their family, and brought a quiet puppy into their lives who would forever be the symbol of the most miraculous journey they would ever walk. If Max and Mia's story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories of love, hope, and miracles that will touch your heart.